Hey there, students of Lit 306E. It's Kathy Inman Barons trying out YouTube Capture because I had to load it. I loaded it today. I thought, that looks like an interesting thing to play with, and trying it also because I just tried to use screen capture within YouTube, and it ate me. So I'm trying this new thing on the idea that if it messes up, I will be able to at least have it in my phone. I don't even know if that's true. I won't have it in my phone, but I will be able to edit it, which I like a lot. I'm going to try to be slightly less blown out by light. Okay, here we go. We're going to talk a little bit about Theory of Adaptation, the book by Linda Hutcheon, and we're going to talk about the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, and we're going to talk about the intimacy of video, which perhaps you're thinking about right now. And we're going also to apply what we're discussing to your assignments that are coming due 2 weeks from today. So first I'll begin by talking about why one of you said that this text was dry, and why probably all of you thought that the text was dry. And the reason is that Hutcheon's using a really robust citational practice. The reason why academics do this is they provide citations as a kind of roadmap, so that if you wanted to look up more information about something that you're reading, you know exactly where to go find it. They also do it to defend themselves against charges that they are making stuff up all by themselves. Sorry, that's way too cheeky. Okay. So what is an adaptation? An adaptation is a repetition with difference. And I think that the first step of it is to break it into two things, to think of it as a process and to think of it as a product. When we think of it from the position of process, what adaptation is first and foremost is an imaginative act of reading. It's a way of thinking about the source text and imagining it in slightly different terms, imagining how it could be different, and how perhaps moving it into a different medium would change the nature of the story. And so step one is to think about the process by which an adaptation is made. I want to also suggest that even if you were creating an adaptation in the exact same medium as your source text, that it could be even still a very original thing. One thinks perhaps of Wide Sargasso Sea, which is a response to the book Jane Eyre. And they're both novels, but Wide Sargasso Sea imagines the terms of Jane Eyre in such a way that it's really impossible to see Jane Eyre the same way once you read Wide Sargasso Sea. So adaptations can also be in dialogue with the source text in ways that are pretty fascinating. And in this book, A Theory of Adaptation, Hutcheon quotes Michael Alexander saying that adaptations are palimpsestuous, which means, and of course, creating sonically alluding to the idea of incest, which is frankly a little creepy, and also talking about the notion of a palimpsest, which is something that can be seen through. It's like an invisible layer. It's a thing on top of something else, so that all the other bits and bobs underneath it can get seen. That's not really how I think of it. First of all, it's too hierarchical, and second, I actually really think that an adaptation is a dialogue. It's taking something that already is polyphonic and turning it into a more focused conversation. And by that I mean, I guess the reason why I was looking up in the sky and thinking is that I was remembering in class tonight, Anna high-fiving the camera. And in doing so, she was invoking Lydia from Lizzie Bennet Diaries, but she was also kind of high-fiving Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice and all the audiences that have partaken of those stories. It was a way of showing membership, thinking a little bit about what it means to really love something and take pleasure in it is also to speak in the terms of the thing you love. So I think that that's also part of adaptation, is audience reception, and that doesn't show up very much in Linda Hutcheon's book, the reception piece, or at least not in the section that we read. So then we've talked a little bit about process. Let's talk about it as a product. An adaptation is a thing that stands as the most recent instantiation of the older thing. It's a way of updating it sometimes, as is the case, say, of Clueless, as an update of Emma, as is the case for Lizzie Bennet as an update or Lizzie Bennett Diaries as an update of Pride and Prejudice. And I spent a little bit of time in class today historicizing Austen's book from 1813 and helping you to imagine why that economic setting for the Bennett family was so important and how it gets remediated in the Lizzie Bennett Diaries. In other words, what I spent my time doing was thinking a little bit about how those settings created engines for story. And I think that that's one thing that Lizzie Bennett Diaries does very, very well, is that preserves some of the narrative urgency, like that you want to know what happens next. Wolfgang Iser is one of the many, many, many critics that Hutching alludes to, and Iser does talk about, and I have been thinking recently about how texts invite you to fill in the gaps with your imagination. That part of any good story is that it can't be utterly complete, and that those gaps invite the reader to jump in and then make her own meaning. This was freshly visited upon me when I was reviewing things that I wanted to show you for class today, none of which I actually got to show you, and I'll have to do that another time. But there's this Billy Collins poem called Forgetfulness that was animated, and I really, even though I thought that the animations were beautiful and that as an art object by itself it was great, I actually really prefer Billy Collins' poem all by itself, in part because Collins' poem was designed to be read aloud, and it is so that the imagery that he evokes got lost because I was so caught up watching the animation that my brain was shuttling between different registers of image, and I couldn't quite reconcile them. And so that's why it wasn't a very satisfying adaptation for me, even though it is a beautiful piece of work. So thinking about product and process, let's think now for a second about imitation, because that's also one element that's relevant when we think about adaptation. Aristotle called it mimesis, and the idea was that it would derive, that the person viewing or participating in the art would derive a great deal of pleasure from mimesis. We thought tonight, I think it was Brandy maybe, who was talking about how realistic the setting, the Lizzie Bennett Diaries setting is, that realistic setting just kind of took this story that is 200 years old and brought it right into our own cultural moment, and that made it more relatable, as some of you talk about. That is true, and that kind of mimesis invites greater identification, and that greater identification then makes us capable of turning around and seeing the 200 years of history intervening between our own cultural moment and Jane Austen's. And that's valuable in and of itself. I also think that the casting of Lizzie Bennett Diaries was so expert that it really did capture the essence of those characters in really great ways. As you can imagine, Lizzie Bennett Diaries, even though it's 5 hours, if you add it all together, probably a little bit more than that, it still had to cut out tremendous chunks of the novel in order to tell its story and to tell it visually. It also had an additional design constraint, which is the producers didn't have very much money, so they didn't have money for real sets, and they didn't have money for costume changes, and they deal with that in such inventive ways. They deal with that constraint so beautifully by having our main speakers impersonate others who aren't on screen. And so Mrs. Bennet, who's one of the comic heroines of all time, is always played by Lizzie, wearing a gigantic hat and earrings and imitating a Southern belle as if to indicate her traditionalism with that dialect. So we've talked a little bit about process and product and mimesis, which is imitation. I want to think a little bit about how this relates to you and your adaptations that you're going to be doing. Joan Didion learned how to write by imitating Ernest Hemingway, and she sat down and just wrote out his words word for word. I would suggest to you that if you wanted to simply copy an artist that you admire, I'm pretty sure that you would learn a lot by doing so, that you learn how a thing is made by getting into the guts of it and really trying to walk in the steps, walk in the shoes that are a little bit bigger than yours. You know, try on Hemingway shoes, or Joan Didion shoes, or Nick Montfort shoes, or whatever, and see, you know, if you can do it. So that's one way to go. Another observation that I'll have is that moving forward in our class, I want us to think a little bit about the difference between storytelling and interactivity. And like a critic called Marie-Laure Ryan has disclosed that there's a tension between these two things. That when the storyteller is telling a story, that's a monologic process where the author is sending out a story and the audience receives that story. Interactivity is a situation in which an author creates conditions in which a reader can discover the story on her own or recombine story on her own. And one thinks about hypertext in particular as something where, well, there are so many examples, but in hypertext where you can follow a series of branches and create a path through those that really is your own. So there's lots to be said about that, but I want you to think a little bit about when you as a reader, have more agency in a story, does that pull you away from the author's intent, if you will? Does that pull you away from the pleasures of being swept up in a story and just sort of sitting back and letting it take you wherever it wants to go? And so I want you to think about whether that's something that's pleasurable to you, that whether you like it that way or whether you like making stories on your own. And I was thinking, when Cody and I were talking tonight about Device 6 and the sorts of interactivity that it requires, it's really about kind of solving puzzles. And so think a little bit about following along with what an artist has laid out for you, or solving a series of puzzles that will add up to a kind of story, and to what extent those things are different from each other. Let's see, I'm going to wind up, what am I going to wind up by saying? I actually think I've hit most of what I wanted to say, except I really do love this quotation from Virginia Woolf that Hutchian alludes to. And Woolf is saying, cinema, this is in 1926, when the language of cinema is still quite new. Woolf says, cinema has within its grasp innumerable symbols for emotions that have thus far failed to find expression in words. And that's a very beautiful way of suggesting that stories are medium specific, and that film might discover new modes of human expression that are inaccessible to us when we rely only on words. And certainly in our class, I'm not interested in valorizing any one mode of storytelling, whether it's textual or visual or sonic or interactive or anything else. I'm really just interested in what we get to discover in those play spaces, and if we can describe what the unique affordances of those play spaces are in ways that compel us and ways that might be replicable. So that's it for Adaptation and Lizzie Bennet Diaries. I'll see you next week.